Hi, James.
Ben, how are you?
I think I need to ask, how are you?
I just realized before we started that I didn't study the ad. I was so determined to study the ad before the ad read, so I wasn't nervous, and now I'm even more nervous than normal.
You need to study the ad and watch her, and then you'll be set. Actually, after this week, you saw the Google Duplex demo, right?
It was insane. As we say that, my Echo just lit up and I was terrified it was about to say something. But no, it was insane. That was absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I mean, see, you need to watch her. Yeah, it was certainly something else. Are you bothered by the fact it didn't identify itself as a bot?
No, I was not actually.
I mean, it's interesting because I can certainly see both sides of the argument. I think folks that were a little over the top about what a terrible ethical lapse this was, it seemed a little. I can understand that point of view. I'm not sure it's that cut and dry, but I don't know. We're not gonna have that debate here. Although we probably generated like 15 emails with
well,
opening.
I look forward to reading them.
The other thing is it's still very far. It's still very far away. I think we'll see what sort of the feedback is and if they sort of adjust their response. But and I think folks didn't realize like they are only focusing for now when it launches. I think they're going to launch only like asking businesses what hours of operation are, and Google's going to run it themselves to update Google Maps, and then they're working on haircuts and restaurant reservations, and that's it. It's not like a general sort of like talking assistant. That's why the basic assistant is still, it's improved, but it's not this level. There's a lot that goes into this.
It was for me, I think this I.O. was for me the point at which you could really start to see how the integration down into machine learning is going to give them an edge as opposed to integrating on the device side and focusing that as the basis of competition. I was like, oh, wow, this is where it starts to get interesting for Apple. This is an area where Google could really start to pull ahead.
Yeah, well, let's first thank WordPress.com for sponsoring Exponent, as they do every week. Did you see how I alleviated your nervousness by talking about something else first?
I totally forgot about it.
What might you want to build on WordPress.com, James?
Well, you know what I'd like to build? I'd like to build an AI that can talk to you. So when you ask me about what's coming next on the ad, it's going to say, Ben, I have the answer. And I think the answer is either a personal blog, a business site, or both.
100, A+. Whether you like to build a personal blog, a business site, or both, creating your website on WordPress.com helps others find you, remember you, and connect with you. You don't need experience. They guide you through the process from start to finish and take care of the technical side to get your site up and running. Their customer support team is made up of WordPress experts eager to help you get the most from your site, and they're available to help 24/7. That is a special call out to James getting the answer completely right. Plans start at just $4 per month, and all plans include a custom domain name for the life of the plan. Go to WordPress.com/Exponent to get 50% off your website today. That's WordPress.com/Exponent. Just one other thing on the Google Duplex demo that I think is interesting and very Google-like, and I didn't mention this in my article, but there's obviously the better solution is that all these companies should have their business digitized, and they should have an online interface, and then like the whole question of a bot interacting with a human is a moot one, because you can just ask Google Assistant to schedule a haircut and it can interact with the system, and it can do it. And I think this is something that I think we've mentioned in passing is actually, particularly in the tier 1 cities in China, is more possible, in part because there was, back when the Groupon craze was happening and there was like 47 clones that sprung up in China with all this VC money, they all went in and digitized all these businesses for them because they wanted to enable them to offer coupons, and it really laid the groundwork for a lot of what you can do with WeChat and stuff in China, in part because all these companies already had sort of these small businesses, the infrastructure already in place, and that's not necessarily ever been the case, in the U.S. And if you're a hair salon, particularly something like a hair salon or a restaurant where you're it's relatively short, your chances of success may be slim and go in and out of business, to ask them to make the sort of investment in that technology. Yes, there's an obvious payoff, but you can understand why it's maybe not as, why there still are a lot of businesses that don't have that. And, from that perspective, if you think about Google, if when they wanted to have every, street view of every street in the world, what did they do?
They hired a whole bunch of people or cars and then just drove them around the road until they got them all, right?
Exactly. And I think something that's underappreciated about Google is it's almost very Amazon-like, that there are certain areas where they will just spend the money and brute force it. And this comes up in the context of self-driving cars, where the Google version of self-driving cars is much less reactive and much less sort of like it's constantly discovering its environment and having to make decisions, where they're mostly only in Mountain View. Why? Because they have mapped every single detail of the area where their self-driving cars go in at a far more deeper level than sort of Google Street View. And people are like, oh well, that means it's long away. How's that going to scale? Well, it's going to scale by Google doing what they already did, which is drive up and down every single road where they want to deploy these cars and get all the data. And one, they're willing to make the investment to do that. And two, Google's approach has always sort of been to just sort of like, it's almost a very simple approach. Like, they're not going to be super smart. They're just going to get far more data than anyone else and leverage that amount of data to sort of make what seemed impossible possible.
I thought you were actually going to a very different place with this, and I was thinking about it in terms of starting to think of the telephone as just effectively like an API. And if business owners start getting these calls and they realize that they're actually computers, I wonder if there's not a business app that Google launches for its Android phones, which allows the same kind of thing to be done on the business side. So you answer a few quick questions about your business, you update your Yelp and your Google phone number, and then basic questions are actually handled by Google, your Android phone, answering the phone, doing all this machine learning, answering the questions. And maybe there's some high pitched noise that allows these two things to identify that they're actually just talking to computers, and it happens immediately. And if there's a question that a consumer happens to ask where the phone doesn't know what's actually going on, the phone is just like, oh, that's a really good question. Can you hang on a second? Let me grab the person that can answer it for you. I started to see a world in which you're never really sure, either on the consumer or the business side, whether you're actually talking to a human or not.
What's interesting too is I just realized that the example I gave Google Maps might have been working in the exact opposite direction that I was thinking, because what I was thinking of was like, well, how's Google getting around the sort of like, a lot of businesses don't have computerized systems, is they're figuring out a way to, even though like voice is super inefficient, they're figuring out a way to like do it anyway. But you could argue that the equivalent to doing Street View of all the maps would be to actually go around to every single business and give them a device that plugs into this, so that the assistant could connect to it. And it could be a way to build, very sort of deep moat with assistant and maps in general. And whereas the having an assistant that figures out how to talk to a human is kind of like the having a self-driving car that kind of figures out the road the first time it sees it. And yeah, so now I have my analogy all completely mixed up in my head. But it's very interesting to sort of think about these the two approaches to overcoming a sort of collective action problem, which is like how do you get a lot of independent entities to all sort of do the right thing, and do you just become so smart that it doesn't matter, which is kind of the Google Assistant approach, or do you sort of brute force it and just put in the legwork necessary to get it done, which is kind of the Google Maps approach, and maybe they are actually opposites. They're not analogous. Now that I think about it,
I want to go back to where you started though. It just is kind of mind-blowing and worth stopping and thinking about the fact that we are going to, in the not too distant future, have devices in our pockets that are convincing enough to pass the Turing test in kind of relatively random situations, like listening to that phone conversation with the appropriate ums and ahs that I know you're going to edit out of this podcast when I make them, but it just made it sound completely believable. It was just crazy.
Yeah, it really was. And I think the ethical debate is interesting because on one hand, you are deceiving someone. On the other hand, there's a sort of, you could make the argument that for the person talking to the bot, it's almost more comforting to not know. You know what I mean? You just have a normal conversation and that person went out their day without anything going on. Whereas like, you're just hi, I'm a bot. Can I have this appointment? It sort of like upsets the entire premise and I don't know. And it's interesting because you can say, well, they should be upset and we shouldn't be going this direction. But my point is the sort of like the ethical and sort of philosophical argument about this, I think, goes many layers deeper than it appears sort of on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with that. I am more of a pragmatic point of view. This isn't like Her, from what I understand of the premise, where you're asking someone to marry it. It's just you're having a conversation. Like, this is an exchange of information. We put it in on websites. I mean, chatbots. I don't know half the time whether I'm talking to a human or I'm talking to an AI. And honestly, when I type in, it doesn't really matter to me. Just help me do what I need to get done. And maybe that's where I start to draw the distinction, actually, where it's trying to perform a task versus the more emotional side where you're starting to build a relationship up. Like, that's where I think it's more important for people. That would, without thinking about it deeply, that's kind of where my line, I think, would be drawn.
Well, and the question is, I think you're mostly thinking about it from the consumer perspective, who is leveraging Google Assistant, and I guess I'm thinking about it from the service worker perspective, the person actually answering the phone. I mean, I think the demonstration was probably a little dishonest in that what's more interesting is what happens when it fails. Like, what does that go down like? And as long as it goes smoothly, I mean, the scheduling a haircut time or taking a restaurant reservation is a very sort of utilitarian exercise. And frankly, the person on the end of the phone wants to get off the phone as soon as possible, and on both sides of the phone, actually. And so that's why if it works well, I guess I don't have a problem with it. Where I have more of a problem and concern, I would say, is when it doesn't go well. And then what happens is the complexity and the frustration are basically being offloaded from the person requesting the reservation or requesting the haircut appointment onto the person receiving that phone call, because they have to deal with a bot that's screwing up. And I think that's where it gets much more problematic, because you're basically offloading complexity onto someone who's not being compensated for it. And I think that is where it definitely gets a lot more problematic.
Well, maybe that's true, but maybe this is the consumer's revenge on businesses, because businesses have been forcing this on consumers for the longest period of time. The number of businesses I call up, and to be granted, it's not normally small business, but the number of businesses I call up and what greets me is an automated system where I have to navigate it in the structure that the business lays out for me is a frustrating thing. And I think by and large, we've all accepted that. This is Google's presenting an option for the consumer to save some time as opposed to just for the businesses to save some time. And there is a human cost that I agree should be considered, and how it fails should be graceful. And completely agree. But this idea that we're turning the tables a little bit or evening things out, I kind of like it.
I think that's a really good point. And the fact that even companies that you pay and often pay a lot of money to, like, force you to endure, minutes long sort of phone trees is if you step back and think about it, pretty outrageous. But the problem is yes, consumers are getting their revenge, but to your point, you kind of mentioned this, they're getting their revenge on, like, the small guy that doesn't have the phone trees. And I guess if you want to, take on, big business, and you want to include your local restaurant in sort of big business, well, then more power to you.
I maybe Google shouldn't be targeting at hair salons and dinner reservations. Maybe it should be targeted at big banks and insurance companies when you need to change address or something. That would be perfect for me. That would seem completely reasonable.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Anyhow, we are rambling a bit, which is fine. I think this might be a little rambly sort of podcast. Something that struck me, and I think is just because this is what I wrote about this week, and followed up a bit in the Daily Update. I think we'll get a little bit into both, in part because I feel the outline of something here, it's not fully fleshed out in my head, but something that really struck me in, I think, watching all these keynotes in close succession, and I actually wrote about this last week, originally after Facebook's keynote, is the attitude of Zuckerberg. And this goes back to the manifesto that he wrote last year. And I wrote Manifestos Monopolies in response. And, and we've talked about multiple times, this sense that Facebook has some sort of solemn duty to push us to being like a global community and all this, when arguably they are certainly fostering community, just very tribalistic ones at that. This sense that they should be, and that they should be making us do something or not. They should make us view other sources of news. They should make us do this, make us do that. And I've pushed back on this a lot because a lot of the criticism of Facebook, to my mind, is so misguided, not because Facebook doesn't deserve criticism, but because the problem with Facebook is not that they are exercising their power in a way you disagree with, but that they have the power at all.
Yeah, and I'm completely 100% with you here. And I think this is, I mean, in the spirit of intellectual journeys, and I reflected a lot on the disruption one last week. I mean, on Facebook, I think we've both been on our respective journeys, but you're pushing me around, oh, we should just regulate this. And the fact that, well, if you're regulating it, then you're just transferring the power from one person to another person. And when I first proposed that, I don't know how many episodes ago now, we had a different administration in the White House. And now the idea that that power would rest in order, the power to control what's going out and what's okay and what's not is resting anywhere at all, I think is a really good point. And I'm 100% with you.
And I've taken the same sort of journey. I mean, I was sort of comforted by, yes, Facebook has a lot of power, but they're sort of, constrained by what's right for the business and whatnot. And, what was so sort of alarming about the Facebook manifesto or Zuckerberg's manifesto a year ago was the sort of explicit admission that we're going to use this power. And yes, it was towards seemingly benign goals and to make the world a better place and foster unity and community and shared sense of facts and right and wrong, all of which sound great. But the problem again is the power, and I was perhaps a bit lax in not being concerned enough about the power because I didn't think it would be utilized. But it's the fact the power exists at all.
Yeah, after we talked about it, Facebook fatigue, one of our readers, Penelope Kansler, wrote in with a quote that I was trying to find during the episode and couldn't. And she just sent it through and I was like, there it is. And it went something, I've got it here in front of me. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under the omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satisfied, but those who torment us for our own goodwill torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And that was C.S. Lewis. And I was like, it's so true. It's this notion that we're doing what's best for you. It's terrifying.
Yeah, I completely agree. But there's sort of one specific piece of that I wanted to sort of pick out this week. We've had the debate about Facebook power and whatnot, and we have an archive if you want to hear that one to say the least. But in this specific case, it was sort of the implied idea that Facebook does stuff for you, and leaving aside what that stuff is or whether we want to do it or not, there's still this idea of like Facebook doing it all. And I actually, back in 2014, so this week in this article, I used the Steve Jobs Bicycle of the Mind clip. And I've used that on multiple times with Checkry. And the first time was actually in the context of Facebook as well. And that was back in 2014 when Facebook bought Oculus. And I was kind of contrasting the idea of, there being technology that sort of augments your life, that helps you do what you were already going to do and doing it better, versus technology that sort of like overwhelms your life and like takes it completely over. And my point there is I didn't buy that Oculus was the platform of the future because I sort of rejected, maybe it was a philosophical rejection, but I sort of rejected this idea that we're going to retreat into this sort of virtual world and VR, to the extent it was a platform, I've always argued to be much more in the sort of like gaming, gaming sort of channel and movie channel, which is a very sort of viable and real part of technology, but it's sort of an escapist sort of part and a smaller, still large, but a sort of smaller part of technology than the sort of day-to-day life augmentation aspect. And that's where I drew that sort of distinction. And I came back to the Bicycle of the Mind thing this week because not just Facebook, but this week alone, there was the Microsoft and the Google keynotes, like in succession. And this just general tone and approach. And we get into why, like Microsoft has very sort of good business reasons to be talking the way they are, but it was so striking, the difference between the Google keynote and the Microsoft keynote. Microsoft could not emphasize again and again about the idea of helping companies do the jobs that they were doing, and they were doing the jobs they were doing better. And some aspect of that was computers doing the job, but it was always framed in a sort of, you can do what you're doing better and more efficiently than you were previously. Whereas the Google framing, and not just the duplex thing, but also things like Google Photos, or they had self-driving cars, is probably the most sort of stark example of, it's not just we're going to help you do the job better. It's that we're going to do the job completely. And you can have more time to do other things. And they never really defined what those other things were. Again, that's not to say it's a bad thing. It was just, if you watch the entire keynotes back to back, it just jumped out at me that there's a very sort of two very different framings of like the same sort of technology.
I love the framing, and I love that the tension that you're drawing at. And as I read it, I was starting to try to dig into why that was. And for me, I think it came down to a question of when these companies were created in the context of the life cycle of technology. And if you think about Apple and Microsoft, computers back when those companies were created were much more in the form of tools. And relates exactly to what that Steve Jobs clip. And we should put that in the show notes, because if you haven't seen it, it really is phenomenal. The way he uses the language. In fact, I really enjoyed it. You put two videos in, like an early version and a latter version when he polished it, and seeing that progression, as is often the case with people who talk a lot and use ideas, they hone it over time, and seeing that progression from nascent through to fully formed and very smoothly delivered was fun to watch. But that was back in a time when computers, like we were just out of the digital equipment corporation era. We're just out of the mini computer era. We're moving into the personal computer era, but these things are still luxuries in the sense that they're mostly used for production. You think about when Google came along in the early 2000s, computers were...
Wait, 1990s.
Late 1990s. You're absolutely right. Late 1990s. They were much more common, but they were still more used as a tool of production. They were still more in the vein of bicycle for the mind. It's starting to shift. It's starting to be the case that computers are everywhere. The internet, and certainly Google's rise mirrors the rise of the internet. As the internet became ubiquitous, so too did Google. But you think about when Facebook was founded and the fact that phones were starting to get everywhere, and their ubiquity has risen as computers have been used. Whether you think about computers as a handheld device or as a personal computer, you think about them as a tool for consumption versus a tool for creation versus a tool for consumption. And I think about it on that spectrum. And that to me explains the DNA of Apple and Microsoft, which is very much, these are tools that we give to creators. And the difference between the two speaks a lot to also, one is more of a personal creation versus an enterprise creation. And Google is kind of bringing that kind of approach, I feel like, more to, you think about Gmail, you think about finding the information you want. That's more of that approach to the internet. But Facebook is starting to shift away from the creation aspect, more into the consumption aspect, where these screens and the devices are more, you sit back and you look at the device and someone else has created stuff for you, and you're just going to passively consume it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think there's no question the companies are shaped by that time period they came up, just as they shaped the time period themselves, right? There's totally. Like, what is the interaction sort of effect there? And I think one thing that definitely did stand out to me, though, is Microsoft and Apple, and it's fascinating because you always think of them as being the opposite, but in so many respects, they really are very, very similar, right? And I think you kind of just made that point well, that they're both personal computer companies. Like that's what they do. And the way they go about building personal computers, and I'm doing a very broad definition of personal computer. Like the phone is the most personal computer that we've had. Right. But Apple, we talked about last week, Apple's been consumer focused, and that wasn't so great in the 80s and was really great in the sort of 2000s. And Microsoft has always been sort of enterprise focused. But at the end of the day, the broad outlines of what they are and what they value and what they sell are are sort of, on the same side of things. And it's interesting, the Facebook and Google comparison, because I think I wasn't quite sure where you're going, but I think your point that Google is more of a sort of tool as opposed to Facebook is just kind of like digital TV in some respects, I think is a good one. I think there's more of a difference between Google and Facebook than there is between Microsoft and Apple in some respects, if you look at it with a certain lens. But the other thing, though, and the similarity that I was sort of driving at, though, is their sort of relationship with like third parties, if that makes sense. And when it comes to Microsoft and Apple, at the end of the day, what you use a computer for are the applications on that computer. Like, if you had a computer with nothing but an operating system, it's not a very fun computer to use. The applications are what actually make it useful. Now, the intricacies of how this actually works are very interesting. I wrote an article many years ago about the iPad from product to platform that sort of highlighted the fact that Apple's much more of a product company and Microsoft's more of a platform company. The problem for Microsoft is they got to be a platform company basically by riding the coattails of IBM, and in this sort of new world where they had to first become a viable, they had to first get users. Then it's been much more difficult for them. Whereas Apple attracts users by virtue of their product, and that gives them the sort of right to be a platform. And I think I concluded that point, like, these companies would be so great together, right? Yeah. Let Apple build the product and acquire the users, and let Microsoft manage the platform, and it'd be kind of a win-win for everyone in some respects. But again, that's very different from both Facebook and Google. In that case, Facebook and Google, similar to a platform, they win by attracting users. But the difference is there's not really any affordances they need to give to third-party suppliers. Like, at the end of the day, people use Google because they want to use Google, right? And Google goes out and finds everyone. And Google could do that because, as we've discussed multiple times in this podcast, when Google came along, the web was so open and there was so many things out there that Google needed to ask permission. They didn't need to convince developers to come onto their platform. Web pages, by virtue of existing, were on Google's platform. And then Google gained all the users, and all the web pages bent over backwards to make their pages even more attractive to Google and more likely to show up. And Facebook is sort of the exact same thing, where Facebook is such a self-contained product, right? What's the moat? What's the lure of Facebook? It's your network. It's the other people that are on Facebook. Like, Facebook's attraction is Facebook. And there's so much more sort of self-contained and not needing to interact with the pieces that go around them. They can just rely on broad-based incentives that force people onto their platform, that I think it forms a sort of very different view of the world, in that Facebook's the most extreme example. Like, Facebook is everything. And that's the sort of frame of mind and approach they take to interacting with everyone. And, Google, I think, is certainly attuned to the fact that openness of the web is a virtue to them. But at the end of the day, Google is Google, and they have power because they're Google. And it's much more sort of self-contained in that. And I think that does shape how they think about what they do and their offering sort of in the long run.
And this is it's so interesting. Early on in what you were saying, you were painting Apple and Microsoft in broad strokes as very similar as personal computer companies and being the same. And I was finding myself agreeing with you, and then thinking about 16-year-old James would have his mind blown if he knew that a few decades later I was going to be sitting on a podcast talking to you and agreeing that Apple and Microsoft are similar. But I think the point is really a well-made one. And the fact that Microsoft hasn't had this school of experience, so to speak, of creating a product that's desirous, that people want to use. And that is the big difference between Microsoft and the other three players. The other three players have created products that people love, and that is a fantastic starting point, inception point for the creation of, in fact, it's almost a necessary one for the creation of new products and platforms, particularly consumer focused ones, because that's almost the big bang that starts the platform afterwards. It's interesting though. I would almost say that as you were speaking, I was drawing a parallel between Google and Microsoft, both of those players are the ones that would recognize the importance of external parties relative to Apple and Facebook. Apple and Facebook, I mean, like you said, Apple's platform, they do it almost under sufferance. This idea that we're letting outsiders onto our beautiful device, like and Apple was reluctant with the iPhone. They wanted it perfect. Do we need other apps? And people weren't. Initially, it was just websites. Facebook's, I feel in a certain sense, kind of the same way, at least in terms of the core product, and putting aside Mark Zuckerberg's platform ambitions, the core product doesn't actually need anything else. And if you turned off elevating external links in the newsfeed, I'm sure it would have something of an impact, but it certainly wouldn't be devastating to the product. Everything that's critical is contained within, that's created by Facebook users. That's what gets people coming back. Whereas Google and Microsoft both absolutely recognize the value of the external players. Google, by virtue of the fact that, like you said, it was born in an open era, the open web, and it was able to go out and crawl. Microsoft, because Lord knows if all people were buying were the operating system way back when, and whether people enjoyed using that, I'm not sure they'd have quite done as well during the 80s and 90s as they did. It would have been Apple. But like you said, it's the developer side of things when it comes to the personal computer is absolutely essential for success.
Yeah, so there's a few things I want to unpack here. I want to get into, I feel like there's some sort of teasing apart of aggregators versus platforms, which is kind of weird because I've always referred to them as being the same thing. I think most people think of them as being the same thing. So that's one. And two, you kind of got to this idea of there being another axis of separation, which is sort of open versus closed. And let's take that one. I guess we can take that one first. So I drew this in the daily update. I didn't put it in the weekly article because it's not fully fleshed out, but this is like, it's something that's sort of, it's one of these ideas that I'm kind of like, I feel the outlines of something here, and I'm kind of trying to figure out what it is, and putting the daily update first, like I get feedback from people about, I'm not sure about that, like that, which is really useful and helpful. But we could, this podcast will be the same thing. We kind of work through it here. So there's a famous thing called the political compass, which is there's two axes. There's authoritarian versus libertarian, and then orthogonal to that, there's sort of the economic left and the economic right, and that there's sort of four quadrants that kind of represent the four ways of thinking about politics: the authoritarian left, the authoritarian right, the libertarian right, and the libertarian left. And this has been used. You've probably seen this on Twitter a lot of times. It's always used in memes to like show like the four different ways to think about something. But I did the same thing in this daily update. We're thinking about like if you have one axis is sort of aggregator versus platform. And by aggregator, I mean where their entire existence is predicated on owning the user relationship and the inherent usefulness of their product, and all sort of third parties come onto their platform because they have no choice, right? And there's that direct connection with customers, versus a platform being where there's a platform on which third parties sit on top, like third party developers or apps or whatever it might be. And both are integral to sort of the user proposition, right? At the end of the day, people use a platform because of the apps and not just apps like phone apps, like applications and line of business software and all the sorts of things that actually make a computer useful. And again, I'm still kind of fleshing out this distinction, but that's one axis. And the other axis is sort of open versus closed. And I think you're exactly right. Google and Microsoft are on the sort of open side. And by open, I mean, of course, they have closed components. I mean, Google's not telling you their search algorithm or their secret sauce that goes into, a lot of their technology, but they greatly benefit and are very understanding from a strategic perspective that they are the most successful in a world where the more things are accessible, because they are the best at discovering and finding and organizing all those things. I mean, it's in the motto, organize the world's information, right? That it follows that the more information that is available and freely available, the better they can be at organizing it. Where and Microsoft, the same sort of thing. Microsoft is always, it's funny, they're criticized for being closed because they have their closed source versus open source, for example. And this closed versus open thing is driving me up the wall, because I did that article a few weeks ago about encryption and open versus closed, and I wasn't talking about source, right? Like if I meant open source, I would have said source. What I mean by open versus closed is the degree to which anyone can walk up and sort of plug into it, right? And the Windows API was super open, and there was hundreds of thousands or millions and millions of applications that were written on top of that API, and that's what cemented Microsoft's hold, and anyone could sort of walk up and plug in. Now, were there parts that they were closed about or very obtuse about, and made it hard to interconnect in a way that, say, for example, third-party operating systems couldn't come along and use those applications? Yes, they were, and that, a lot of that stuff came up in the antitrust cases that they had, but at least on at least one very important sort of vector, they were extremely open, particularly relative to a company like Apple, which, as we've talked about, has sort of been dragged kicking and screaming into supporting third-party applications. And yes, there's a ton of them on the phone, but through like their business policies, for example, as we've talked about ad nauseum, they never sort of wanted to allow a big competitor, or not a big competitor, but like a big customer like an Adobe, for example, to ever be able to be built in a way that could threaten them in the long run. And I think to their detriment. There's an article I wrote back in 2013 about this. Why doesn't Apple enable sustainable business in the App Store? And I really think it goes back to they never wanted any sort of developer to have that sort of power, whereas Microsoft's like, come on, by all means, build your multi-billion-dollar business on our platform, because that is going to be to our long-term benefit. And that's one of the reasons why Microsoft has always been such a great sort of platform company. Anyhow, to bring this quadrant full circle, the sort of aggregator closed company is Facebook. They don't want to leaving aside what we've been talking about the last few weeks, they at least in theory don't want to share their power is their network. It's their totality of information that they have, and keeping that in a sort of closed garden and everything internal Facebook. They want to keep you on the on the news feed and bring stuff into there. It's very different than Google. And one of the reasons why Facebook was even successful was because they were closed off from Google. Google couldn't break into Facebook and get all the wealth of information that was there. And Facebook had exclusive data that not even Google had, unlike basically anyone else that sought to be a sort of Google competitor. And so they're more on the sort of the closed side, similar to Apple in some respects. But when it comes to the sort of platform aggregator idea, they're more akin to Google.
So I'm with you 100% on the open versus closed, but it's interesting that you draw it as a platform versus aggregator view of the world, because I've always thought about it more as a product versus platform view of the world. That's always made a lot more explanatory sense to me, like whether the company is a product focused company like Apple or a platform focused company like Amazon, for example. I guess that then begs the question, what about the difference between aggregators and platforms is making you want to dive in and use this as the framework, like the basis for this one of the axes?
Well, I guess I would back up and say they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I'm not saying they should be on the same sort of 2x2, or it should be a 3-dimensional 2x2, which I've definitely seen consultants try to pull off. But rather, it just depends on what aspect of the company you're looking at. And I think this is where 2x2s get really dangerous, because they inherently flatten out something that is multidimensional and multi-part. And like I said, as I kind of said in my rambling sort of, deposition there, is as I just sort of kind of said, like there's parts of these companies that are open, parts of them are closed for all of them, and that idea of commoditizing your compliments is another way of saying keep closed what is yours and try to open up everything that isn't yours, so you can engender competition in those sorts of things. So I guess my first sort of response would be there's lots of ways to look at this, and I don't think they're in opposition. It's just you would want to take different lenses and different views to the issue to get a sort of totality of understanding, because these are complex entities, and to think that any one definition gets it completely right, I think is mistaken. And just before I answer your question, I'm kind of rambling. I'm kind of going the long way around here. I think the other thing here too is, for me, and I for something like aggregation theory, right? I'm very proud of it. I think it's very explanatory about the way the internet works and the way that it's different from the way the world worked before. I also think it's a mistake, and one that would be tempting for me to fall into, to think that's the end, that now we understand it and everything is explained by this. And I don't think I fall in that too much, but the bringing it up all the time, I think, could certainly lend that sort of idea. And in some respects, what's been interesting to me about this is sort of starting to tease that apart a little bit, because I've referred to aggregators as platforms, and the idea of there being Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple are all platforms is sort of commonly accepted. These are all platform companies. And again, what stood out to me and was trying to tease that this week is there's something different, though, I feel, about these companies. And again, when I drew out both a platform and an aggregator, I think it's the relative position of customers to the sort of third parties and the power that gives the company in the middle relative to those sort of third parties and their priorities and the things that result from that. So, I've used my usual aggregator drawing, which is kind of a funnel all going into one entity. And that entity has like a funnel on the other side. That's all the customers. It's like the squeezing of the balloon. And if you're Google and all the customers start on the internet by going to Google, then that's how the funnel sort of it forms itself on the other side in a natural reaction. Like if you squeeze a balloon, it's not just one side of the balloon that sort of funnels down to the point where it's being squeezed, right? Both sides do, and that's the way that it is for Google and for Facebook. By owning the customer, everyone has no choice to sort of acclimate themselves to where they are. So there's suppliers, aggregator, users, and that's sort of the order. Apple and Microsoft are different, though, and they're different in that sort of structure where there's users, but then there's the third parties, and then there's the platform sort of underneath. But the way the payment works and the way the interaction works is the users actually pay both. They pay the third parties and they pay the platform. But the structure is different. The placement of sort of the suppliers is different. And I think the way, again, it ties into the business model, as I just sort of mentioned, where if you're squeezing it like an aggregator, that's the optimal place to put ads. There could not be a better place in the world to put advertisements. If you're a platform and you have third-party applications sitting on top of you, you can't be an advertiser. This is why Android doesn't have advertisements, even though Android is more of a platform than an aggregator, and it has no advertisements because there's nowhere to put them. Like because it's a place to let other applications shine, other applications sort of sit on top of it. And so I think there is some kind of distinction there. Maybe I'm using the wrong words to use aggregator versus platform. Maybe platform is a word that has such broad meaning that it's kind of like disruption, like it's almost lost the sort of like narrow meaning that it was intended to have. But I mentioned when I was at that University of Chicago antitrust thing, and it was about digital platforms, and it like right away, this is something that stood out to me immediately. Like there's a mistake being made in putting all these companies in the same bucket, because the way that Facebook and Google interact with their ecosystem is very different from the way that Microsoft and Apple and Amazon interact with their ecosystem.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so a couple of big differences between the two come to mind. And I think perhaps in this instance, and maybe I'll come to regret these words, but advertising is actually something of a red herring here. I think about it in terms of who ends up capturing most of the value, and also how suppliers need to behave in order to create value. I mean, in the instance of Microsoft, Apple, and Google, all three are reliant on external providers, not customers, but external providers, in order to create more value than they would ever be able to create themselves. Now, Apple in particular is good at getting that value going in the first instance in terms of kickstarting. You think about the iPhone, amazing product, or the likelihood that they're going to develop core applications in-house to develop this fantastic experience. But even they, as a personal computer manufacturer, most of the value that they create for their users is actually, when you think about as a user using an Apple device or using a Microsoft device, most of the value right now using an iPhone is created through applications that Apple had no party in, and the developers had to plug in it wasn't like Google where the web pages were already in existence and Google came along and just made them more accessible. These had to be created for the purpose of Apple's operating system, Apple's ecosystem. Same with Microsoft. These applications had to be created for the purpose of Microsoft's ecosystem. And so you effectively have two suppliers as an end user in that sense, like you said, and the value is created and shared equally by those two parties because they create something new that otherwise wasn't there. Google, on the other hand, is able to just organize things better than they otherwise could. Those websites were already out there. And as a result of not necessarily requiring other parties to do something, in order for the search engine to work, because the web was already open, they get to capture a majority of the value of what goes on top of their platform as an aggregator. And Facebook's unusual in this sense, in that really, again, yes, there are links to outside content, and yes, that does drive a lot of traffic, but it's far from necessary for that platform or that as an aggregator to work. Again, they don't need anyone else to create anything new for the platform to be valuable. So they get to capture a majority of the value, and their users, which are the ones that came there in the first place, are a big part of creating that ongoing value that makes the platform itself valuable. Does that make sense?
This is a situation where you, by coming in, perfectly articulated what I was trying to say. And I that's exactly right. Facebook is actually the ultimate example, because Facebook could be valuable and attractive without there being any third-party content at all. It's completely self-contained. And this ties into the realization I had in the context of Zillow and the idea of integration and how the sort of fragmentation of the supplier base is really important. Google was valuable because of third-party content, but that third-party content already existed, right? And your point that that applications have to be made for platforms is a very, very different sort of interaction between the platform and the third party, as opposed to the aggregator and the supplier, where the supplier is completely at the mercy of the aggregator. And this and your point about advertising red herring is spot on. This is why things like Airbnb and Uber and stuff like that are aggregators, because the suppliers are complete commodities, and they go onto the platform themselves willingly because it's the only way to reach the end users that they seek to reach. Whereas developers kind of have a choice in the matter to some respect. Now, it gets fuzzy. Again, these aren't like clear, distinct lines, but I really do think there is a distinction here between aggregators and the way to think about them, and from a policy perspective, from a strategic perspective, from understanding their opportunity perspective, versus platforms that it's very, very different.
I think it's fair to say that this is one of these, a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't a square. I think almost all the aggregators are platforms, but not all platforms are aggregators. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think they really are. I don't think it's a superset.
What I guess I'm trying to drive at is this distinction between how dependent you are on the suppliers and whether you actually need to convince the suppliers, or whether you need suppliers at all, is the point at which you go from platform into aggregation land. And the further you get away from needing those suppliers in order to be successful, the more you are the more you're an aggregator.
Maybe I see what you're driving at, because certainly both sides, both types are ultimately dependent on having end users, right? Like that's the sort of, that's what powers them. And to that extent, they are similar. I guess the thing that kind of gives me a little bit of pause is it's probably the degree of commoditization of the third parties, which maybe is the same thing that you're saying. And I guess maybe because I'm visually thinking about where third parties are in the value chain relative to customers, where they do have a direct sort of connection with customers. Like, people use Photoshop from Adobe, right? And people who care about Photoshop the operating system is much more incidental to it, right? And if you're a hardcore, this has come up in the context of like Apple, like the Mac Pro, right? If you actually need the capabilities of that level of computer, you will absolutely change the underlying computer because of the application that you need. That's actually more important. And if you think about it, just sort of, and maybe I'm thinking too visually and sort of like picturing the order of this value chain, but it just feels like it's kind of flipped a little bit relative to aggregators, where when it comes to an aggregator, the third party stuff, it's just the degree of commoditization is basically total, and in a way that it's not necessarily on a platform. But again, maybe I'm drawing too fine a distinction when it's probably much more of a spectrum.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is the example you drew goes way, way, way back to the start of the conversation, which is Photoshop is from an era when it was about tools as opposed to more and production as opposed to, and almost more of a B2B type thing where it's a few people who wanted a lot and will go anywhere for that specific tool versus as you get into the more modern era, and maybe this is just coincidental, but as I think about that spectrum and we started with Apple and Microsoft and then we moved to Google and then we got to Facebook, it's almost as if there's a relationship between as you get more and more consumer focused, the degree of dependence on the suppliers lessens even further.
Well, here's an interesting way to think about it. We talked about in the context of Zillow how the sort of real aggregators, if aggregation is to disruption, as in like a means to change a value chain, but it's not the end state. Like you have to achieve some sort of integration. And I kind of posited that integration probably needs to go into the actual like transfer of money in that value chain. And it could be indirectly via advertising. It could be directly like where you're into the house buying process, for example, or you're into the hotel booking process, like in the context of booking.com. And I was thinking about this as you were talking in the context of Netflix, because what's interesting about Netflix is not I think I was wrong to focus on the commoditization point because TV shows are not necessarily commoditized. I mean, they're perhaps getting to that point. There's so many of them, but still people seek out specific shows. Right. But why would I still think about Netflix? I would not think of Netflix as being a platform. I would absolutely think of Netflix as being an aggregator. Why? And I think it's about that integration. Like they have fully integrated not just the sort of customer acquisition and relationship side of it, but also the actual transaction. And Netflix takes care of paying sort of the other side. Whereas a platform, it is like you pay Adobe and you pay Apple and you pay Microsoft, however it might flow. Like, so maybe I lucked into this, but I put dollar signs on that graph that I drew for the article this week where money is flowing to third parties and it's flowing to the platform. And it's more sort of the money flow is more complex in the relationships that are entailed. A platform is like multiple relationships, whereas the aggregator, there's one relationship and everything sort of follows from that.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, I think it gets muddied a little bit by the emergence of app stores. But if you imagine that wasn't just done for user experience and centralization point of view, and that the iOS app store represents the same world and Apple's just effectively a very expensive Visa acting as an intermediary, this notion that the money is flowing to third parties and there is something of a relationship with third parties, whereas a true aggregator has got all the finance.
I'm sorry. Can I jump in?
Yeah.
No, I'm very excited about this. I think you just really you touched on something super interesting. We talked about how Apple has been drag kicking and screaming to being a platform because they don't allow like business to thrive. How can they control the business relationship of entities on iOS? It's because of the App Store. Apple has sort of imposed an aggregator type control method on what should be a platform. You think about all the things that developers sort of chafe against. It's not the APIs per se. It's not the APIs aren't limiting developers from building something amazing. It's the business model. The business model is the problem. And Apple, like the pieces are there to be a platform for iOS, but it's not. It's sort of a stunted platform because the business model pieces have been superseded by an aggregation type business model where Apple has commoditized all these apps and sort of cut them off at the knees when it comes to building real businesses. And yes, it's gotten a little better, but I think the ship may have sailed a sort of bit. And like that's sort of like, why is the app sort of different from sort of the traditional PC era? Why are the businesses so much smaller? Why are the only real sort of big companies ones that build these sort of free-to-play games and whatnot? And I think that kind of gets at it. An aggregator doesn't allow the creation of huge businesses down the value chain because the point is to commoditize everything. Sorry, I interrupted you, but that was I was very excited.
I'm glad you
about
did.
That.
No. I'm glad you did. I mean, that's an excellent point. Thinking about it from the money flows and then thinking about Apple's relationship, the way that Apple's inserted itself. But to be fair, let's not forget that had I mean, think about applications in the mobile world before Apple interjected. And I remember trying to download apps onto my Nokia phone and it being a very janky kind of frontier bulletin board-esque kind of experience where I wasn't sure if I was about to download a payload that was going to wipe my phone or do much, much worse. And the iOS store was born out of the fact that perhaps the experience did warrant centralization. And I think the point that it's gone too far and that in attempting to standardize the business practices, not just making the software trustworthy, but only allowing businesses to charge the consumers in a certain kind of way has imposed too much of a stringent control for what should be a platform that looked more back in the world of box software or whatever before this existed, where it was much more of a bazaar. Like they've actually taken it too far.
Yeah, I would say 2 points. One, I agree, and two, this isn't a sort of, there's no value judgment here. Like I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other. And I think to your point, why do aggregation models win? They win because they provide a better user experience. And this is a great example. The iOS App Store is a phenomenal user experience relative, not even just old mobile phones, relative to the PC. Like we got to the point where people wouldn't install applications on their PCs because they were scared of like viruses and they were scared of what, like they were trained to not do any of this stuff. One of the reasons that that internet and web apps became a thing is because people they were scared to install stuff, or they were barred from installing stuff at their work. So there is a sort of inherent trade-off here. And again, if you think about the value chain, if one entity is controlling all the interactions with the customer, like it goes, it's like that. If you control everything, you can provide a better user experience. You could provide better security and all sorts of things. Again, giving you trust the centralized entity. The trade-off is the centralization of power and the centralization of control that inherently follows from that, to take this podcast sort of full circle. Whereas on the other hand, if you foster a much more open environment where anyone can walk up and anyone can build a relationship with the customers, it's more dangerous, it's more risky. The user experience by and large is going to be worse, but this sort of opportunity for innovation and things that can be built and new ideas that can come to fruition, because there is no gatekeeper. There is no one entity controlling everything, is much larger. And this is the sort of conclusion that I had, is we do need both, and to get too wrapped up in one or the other. And that's why I don't make a judgment as to which one is good or which one is bad. I mean, I guess I'm tying a lot of things together. In the original article, I was talking about we need the philosophy of computers doing stuff for us and also computers enabling us to do more. And like computers doing stuff for us gives us time and opportunity to do more, right? Like both pieces make sense. And in the case of, if you want to get that into the underlying subtext of this article, which is sort of aggregators, platforms, both do make sense. Both have benefit. And it really is sort of the yin and yang of technology. And I one line of regret. I think I said they were in opposition to each other. They're not in opposition. It's more orthogonal. Like it's the two axes that I said. And I don't know. For me, just like just an interesting. It's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, it totally is. It was funny that as you were describing the pros and cons, and you want both, it was funny. I was going back to your picture that you described of the political version of this, the quadrant, and thinking that we could almost say the same things, like both have pros and cons. And you think about the innovation, and it's more dangerous, and you can associate that with, well, I'm not going to do it here, but as you think about it in terms of politics, you can make the exact same assertions about the benefits of some versus the benefits of others. It's not necessarily there's a right answer, an optimal one, though everybody has their beliefs and their preferences, but they just come with different sets of trade-offs.
That's exactly right. It comes with different sets of trade-offs, and the what matters those trade-offs depends on the lens you look at it, right? It's sort of, if we could tie everything in a nice bow. When you look at a problem in different sorts of ways, different things matter. If you look at it in the short term versus the medium term versus the long term, if you think about the impact on one group of people versus multiple groups of people versus the interaction effects of the different groups working together, like, and this is why, I mean, at the end of the day, like, there is no right answer. It's like talking about Amazon and Apple last week, right? There is no one right way to run a company. There is no one right way to do anything. Everything is a trade-off, and context does matter. And is that to say that I'm amoral and there's no right or wrong? No, not at all. But you can have an underlying principle and guiding way of thinking about the world and a sense of right and wrong, and appreciate that different situations, depending on the context, how you look at them, can have different answers. And a lot of times it's choosing the least bad, or it's choosing, ideally the best. But if you're not cognizant of the potential bad, you end up in situations like we've been talking about over the last few years, where you do stuff with the best of intentions, and the actual outcomes and impact end up being something that wasn't anticipated at all.
Just like the conversation on this podcast.
Indeed. Well, like I said, I thought we were going to be a little more exploratory here. I guess that's how was feeling about this topic this week in general. But I think this is good. I love the
me too.
So anyhow, our thanks to WordPress.com for sponsoring this episode of Exponent. You can go to WordPress.com/Exponent to get 50% off your order. And I will talk to you next week.
You'll quiz me next week?
Maybe. We'll see. I mean, we'll see. You nailed it this week. So I kind of feel like I had to quiz you until you just totally nailed it. And now I feel bad. I feel like I'd be picking on you to go back to the well.
Well, let's see whether you pick on me next week.
Yeah, we'll see.
Have a good one, mate.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye.